The two terms linguistic philosophy and linguistic analysis are both used to mean the same thing, and that is a technique of doing philosophy which developed mainly in the Anglo-Saxon world and which came to fruition in the 1940s and 50s, though I think it's fair to say that the way almost everybody since then has done philosophy has been influenced by it. The two great centres of activity in it were Oxford and Cambridge. At Oxford, the most influential figure was J.L. Austin, and, to a lesser degree, Gilbert Ryle. At Cambridge, it was incomparably Wittgenstein. These and the other individuals involved all differed among themselves, naturally, but they had certain basic tenets in common. Perhaps the chief of them can be put this way. Ever since Socrates, philosophers have tended to ask questions like, what is truth? Or what is beauty? Or what is justice? On the assumption that each of these words stands for something, perhaps an invisible or abstract something, but anyway, something that has its own existence independently of how the words are used. It was as if the philosophers were trying to pierce through the question, through the language, to some non-linguistic reality that stood behind the words. Now, the linguistic philosophers came along and said that this was a profound error, and an error, what's more, that leads us into other serious mistakes in our thinking. There are, they said, no entities for which these words stand. Language is a human creation. We invented the words, and we determine their use. Understanding what a word means is nothing more nor less than knowing how to use it. So, taking a notion like truth, when you fully understand how to use the word truth correctly, and its associate words like true, truthfulness, and so on, then you fully understand its meaning. This meaning simply is the sum total of the word's possible uses, not some incorporeal entity that exists in some abstract realm. From this, linguistic philosophers went on to say that the only satisfactory way to analyze the categories of human thought, or the concepts in which we try and come to terms with the world or communicate with each other, is by investigating how they're used. And doing linguistic philosophy consists in carrying out such investigations. In fact, the most famous book in linguistic philosophy is called Philosophical Investigations by Wittgenstein. Normally, such an investigation would be into one concept at a time, as it might be, say, the concept of mind, which is the title of what is probably the second most famous work in linguistic philosophy, a book by Gilbert Ryle. For some years after the publication of these two books, Ryle's in 1949, Wittgenstein's in 1953, linguistic analysis exercised an enormous spell on philosophy, and in those years it came at the very least to colour the way the subject was practised by almost everyone in the English-speaking world. To discuss it now on this programme, we have someone who has spent many years each at both Oxford and Cambridge. Bernard Williams, now one of the two professors of philosophy at Cambridge, was an undergraduate at Oxford in the heyday of linguistic philosophy there. Well, Bernard Williams, the philosophy that linguistic philosophy represented a breakaway from was primarily logical positivism, wasn't it? Logical positivism was the prevailing orthodoxy of one generation, linguistic philosophy of the next. And I think a way in which we can continue the characterization of linguistic philosophy that I started in this introduction is by talking about the contrast between it and the logical positivism that it broke away from.
I think we were very conscious of the difference from logical positivism, and perhaps more conscious than people will be looking at all later on. But the real difference, I think, was this, that positivism tremendously thought of the canon of human meaningful discourse and knowledge as being science, really. It admitted that there were other forms of discourse as well, but it measured the meaningfulness of other discourse by really the standards of science. And for positivism, philosophy almost was the philosophy of science, whereas linguistic analysis or linguistic philosophy was tremendously and self-consciously aware of the variety of different forms of human discourse. There were many different ways of talking, many different sorts of meaning besides scientific meaning, and the business was to try and discover how these various other sorts, as well as the scientific sorts, worked, not to measure everything by the canons of science and pronounce the other sorts meaningless.
The logical positivists did in fact quite explicitly say, didn't they, that any statement which was not empirically verifiable was meaningless.
Yes, except for the, as it were, statements of mathematics, which were just true in virtue of the meanings of the words, as it were. But certainly all the statements of ethics or aesthetics or religion, and indeed many everyday psychological statements, I suspect, by the positivist canon were meaningless.
So whereas, for example, the logical positivists would have said that religious talk was meaningless, talk about God and so on was meaningless, because there was simply no way in which any of it was verifiable, the linguistic analyst might have been inclined to say, well, before we pronounce this meaningless, let's have a very close look at what precisely the concepts are that are being used here, how they're being used, how they function within this universe of discourse, and so on.
Oh, yes, they not only might have been, they were very disposed to say that, and were always publishing books called Faith and Logic. That was the little title they tended to have, in which they thought... Of course, it has got a rather curious, ironical, two-sided aspect, that business, because although linguistic philosophy, for instance, was, as you say, kinder towards religious language than positivism had been, which at least did it the honour, in a sense, of showing it off the premises as empirically meaningless, the linguistic analysts were a little disposed to say, well, here we have this form of discourse, which is one form of human life like any other, and of course it implicitly already gave an extremely, as it were, humanistic interpretation of religion. It tended just to regard religion and religious belief as a form of human life, as an expression of human needs. And while there are many, including some now among the clergy, who would agree with that, it wasn't perhaps everybody's traditional idea of religious belief.
We've distinguished linguistic philosophy from logical positivism. There's another distinction which I think it's very important that we should make at the outset of this program, and that's the distinction between linguistic philosophy and the philosophy of language. Those two phrases are so similar that I think someone unfamiliar with philosophy could easily be forgiven for mixing the two up or for supposing that they were names for the same thing. But they're not, are they? And I wonder if you would make clear what the distinction is.
Well, I think that there is an important distinction there in the following sense, that the philosophy of language, as I understand it, is a branch of philosophy. It's an area of philosophy. It's that part of philosophy which particularly concerns itself with questions raised by language itself. It's now a very flourishing and indeed in many ways a very technical subject, and of course it borders very closely onto theoretical linguistics. Whereas I think we understood linguistic philosophy or linguistic analysis to be not a branch of philosophy but a method of philosophy, which addressed itself to philosophical questions raised all over the place. I mean, the questions of metaphysics, of ethics, questions about the meaning of ethical statements, what one ought to do, and so on, and all other branches of philosophy, but offered a certain method for addressing those same questions, one which particularly laid emphasis on being self-conscious about the language in which those questions were raised.
And of course it did offer a certain promise, didn't it? I mean, precisely because the idea was that there was no content in any part of our conceptual scheme that was not put there by us. And therefore, if you carried out a thorough analysis of the way a particular concept functioned, there was no remainder, nothing was left over. The projection of this into philosophical investigation was expected to result in the problems being finally solved, wasn't it?
Well, the phrase that so often was used, and I think still can be heard somewhere, is not solved but dissolved. The idea was that many of the traditional problems of philosophy had been based on a misunderstanding, a very simple idea of how our language worked. And once that you became self-conscious about the way our language worked, came to understand the kind of meaning that we'd given our expressions, you'd see that, as it were, you couldn't just put some words together and hope that these problems would find their own destination, if I can put it that way. Thought couldn't just whiz through the words and get to reality. Our questions meant just what we made them mean, as it were. It was only our practice which determined what these questions meant. Now, that meant that a lot of questions of philosophy weren't one question at all. The idea was they were often a collection of different worries, different puzzles, which had been put together under some simplifying formula. And when you saw through that, and remember it's also called linguistic analysis, had analytically taken the problems apart, then you'd find that many of the traditional questions of philosophy had not just been solved, but had disappeared. You no longer needed to ask them anymore. And the promise that this offered of this being so was very great and extremely exciting. And I mean, there really were people around who were saying the whole of philosophy would be over in 50 years. It would all be finished.
We'll have exhaustively analysed the use of all the basic concepts, and when we've done that, there will be nothing left to do.
Or at least you'll have got rid of the ones that give rise to the problems, the characteristic of the philosophical problems. Yes, surely.